Hello everyone, welcome to Cooking with Countryside. My name is Melissa and today we are going to be making a tomato tart. So this is going to highlight the fresh tomatoes of the season and also onions, garlic, and a little bit of basil. So the things that you can get from the market, like I said, are tomatoes. So I'm using small tomatoes, obviously. And we're going to cut those in half, but you could use any variety of tomato that's larger and you'll just cut it into thin slices. We're also going to need garlic, onions, cheese, and you can pick your cheese of choice. I'm going to use mozzarella for today, and fresh basil. And the ingredients that we'll need that you cannot find at the market are olive oil, salt, and flour. That's a great ingredient that you need, is the flour. And you can get that at the market. I'm using an all-purpose flour. If you use spelt flour, that would be a little more nutrition value, or you could even try maybe a whole grain flour. So to start, we're gonna actually make the dough. So there's an option with this tart. If you don't want to make the dough yourself, you could buy a dough already made, but this is really easy. It's vegan because it uses olive oil as the base instead of egg. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to mix together flour and salt. So I am using 2 cups of flour and I'm going to use about a teaspoon of salt. And if you have like Morton salt or something like that, I suggest using that instead. All I have is a salt grinder, which will have to work. So I'm just going to mix this in with a whisk so that the salt gets incorporated. And the next thing we're going to add, we are going to add, see what my notes say here, the olive oil and half a cup of cold water. So we're going to use a 1/4 cup of olive oil and then half a cup of cold water. So mine is in the fridge now chilling. Okay, and then half a cup of cold water. And you definitely want it to be cold. It's going to help it stick together better. So then I'm just going to whisk this all together and start to get it all incorporated. And if you have a dough hook on like a KitchenAid type mixer, you could always try to use that. But if you don't, that's okay. You can still make this. So as you can see, it's starting to get kind of a little bit more crumbly now, which is good. That's what we want. And also for this, I'm going to be using a tart pan. If you don't have a tart pan, you can also use a pie pan for this, or you could use a baking sheet or like a glass baking dish. It'll just be a little bit different shaped, obviously, but it'll still cook okay. Okay, so now my dough is all incorporated, no more liquid left, and it's starting to get a bit crumbled, which is good. And it's very stuck to my whisk, so that's fun. So the next thing we're going to do is we are going to roll this dough out and then place it in our pan and let it chill for a minute just so it sets. So if you would like to lightly flour your surface, that would be our next step. Okay, perfect. So I'm just gonna dump this all down, and I am by no means a baking expert. So if you have a tip or trick, comment below and help everyone else out. But this is kind of basic and it's easy too. So if you're a little intimidated by baking, I mean, that was what, 4 ingredients: cold water, salt, flour, and olive oil. And like I said, it is vegan, so a lot of your doughs will have eggs in them. This is a great alternative. So here I'm just incorporating it and pressing it all out, as you can see. If you have a rolling pin, you could use that, or the edge of your whisk. And then I'm using a 9-inch tart pan. So it looks like this, and it has a removable bottom. So once we start to cool it, we can take off the sides for it to cool. Or if you want to serve it, you won't have to have the sides there. And actually, I rented this from the Akron Public Library. So they do have pan rentals if you are interested. just a shout out to them. That's a great program offered in our community. So I'm going to just take my dough and place it in the pan, and then I'm gonna adjust it so it's covering the whole pan and that nothing is really spilling out over the sides. So you can take a knife if you want it to look really pretty, or you can just take your fingers and then fill in the spots that are not covered. So basically we just want everything to be even for a great end result. So if you use a larger tart pan, you might want to add a little bit more flour, but you could probably make this stretch to a 12-inch pan, but you might not get your dough all the way up the sides, so that's something you would want to consider. But this is looking nice. So now that we have this all configured, I'm just gonna pop this in the fridge while we're making the filling. That way it can cool and it'll have a little bit of time to set into this mold. So the next step is going to be to chop our onions. We are going to use 2 onions for this. And they can be chopped as big or as small as you would like. We are going to cook them down before we bake them, but it really depends on when you are eating this tart, if you want to eat just a small bite at a time or a larger piece. So I'm probably going to cut them into thinner strips, so not super small pieces, but not huge chunks. So smaller than a kebab chunk, but bigger than a diced onion. And I'm sure this is probably everyone's favorite part of cooking, right, is cutting the onions. So I'm cutting them into pieces. I'm going to separate them, pieces about this big. But again, this is a little bit of cooking and a little bit of baking all in one. I'm not exactly sure what you would classify this as. But whew, I feel it in my eyes now. Normally for me it's the red onions that get me, but if there's some strong onions, that means they were grown well, right? Stinging. Okay. And again, just 2 onions and a quick chop. Holy moly. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to heat a little bit of olive oil in a pan, and once that gets hot, we're going to add the onions. So you're going to kind of want a little bit of a larger skillet. The only other thing that we're going to add to it is the garlic, and we're just using 2 cloves of garlic. So as long as you can fit all of your chopped onion in here, you'll be good. But I'm using a larger size. Hopefully you can see that okay. Whew. Wow, that's a strong onion. Okay, and while we are waiting for that to start to cook down, we're gonna want them almost like caramelized. We're gonna want them. I hope you guys are getting a kick out of me in my onion eyes. But we're gonna want to cook the onions till they're translucent. So if you would like to go all the way till caramelization, feel free. But we're gonna use 2 cloves of garlic. This is a rather large clove of garlic, so I might use like 1.5 for just this one. I'm gonna go ahead and mince it now and then add it to the pan after those onions get translucent. And at this point, it might be a good time to preheat your oven. We're gonna need to get it up to 350 degrees. Ooh, okay. So it's been about 10 minutes since I put that tart in the fridge. So I went ahead and put it in the oven because we're gonna have to cook the crust for 20 minutes at 350 before adding any of the filling. So my onions are still sizzling behind me on the stove. And so I'm waiting for them to cook down. My tart crust is in the oven. So now the final step that we really need to prepare is to chop our tomatoes. So we're going to use a pound of tomato. Like I said, if you are using a larger tomato, you're just going to want to cut it into thinner wedges. Since I'm using a cherry tomato, I am just going to cut it in half like that. So I'm just going to go ahead with all my tomatoes and chop them. And then the other thing we're going to do is we are going to chop our basil. So there's an option you have. You can either add the basil to the filling or just add the basil as a garnish on the top. I think it's going to be really yummy to add a little bit in the filling, or you could even add some as the first layer on that crust. Or for even another option, if you watch this video before you make it and think this is a good idea, you can chop up probably about half a cup of the basil and fold it into your tart dough and incorporate it in there. I think that would be pretty good too. But if you're making along with me, any of the first, 2 or 3 options that I mentioned will be good for you. And I am definitely a huge fan of the smaller tomatoes. I just like the bite-sized one, especially when you just pull them off of the vine and they're still warm from the sun and they're nice and juicy. Those are my favorite tomatoes. But what about you? What are your favorite tomatoes? You can leave a comment below and say. I know a lot of you were able to attend our tomato tasting, which was virtual this year, but it still turned out great. Okay, so all my tomatoes are just gonna sit here and wait. And then I could say you could take a handful of basil, and again, you can either chop this or leave the leaves whole. I think I might actually just leave the leaves whole, so I'm gonna leave it as it is. So when your onions are done cooking, they're a little bit translucent, they might be a little bit browned even, you can go ahead and add your cheese. So I turned off the heat, my garlic was already cooking in there, and I'm just gonna add the cheese, mix it up. It will melt right into the onion and it's gonna taste really good. And then you can just let that sit until your tart crust is finished doing its preliminary 20-minute cooking. So it's been 20 minutes and I just pulled my tart shell out of the oven. So the next thing I'm gonna do is I am going to fill it with a layer of those cheesy onions that we made. So for me, it's looking like I'm just gonna scrape a little bit of onions off the top just to give a little more room for the tomatoes. So next we're going to just layer all these tomatoes on the top here, and you can kind of press them down if you would like. You can put them all face up, all face down, all different. That is totally up to you. I'm gonna put them face up just so we can see the seeds and it'll look prettier, maybe, I don't know. So I'm just gonna keep layering. And then what we're gonna do is we're gonna throw this tart back in the oven for 20 more minutes or until the crust gets a little bit golden. And so you can overlap the tomatoes as much or as little as you would like, depending on what kind of flavor you're looking for. Okay, so now I'm just gonna throw this back in the oven. Okay, so now our tart is out of the oven and we just have to let it cool. The last thing that we're gonna do is we're gonna add fresh basil on top. So you can either chop it up or just add the leaves as is. And then you're ready to cut it and enjoy. And you can serve this warm or you could cool it before serving, that's up to you. So I'd like to thank you for watching. And if you're interested in learning more about this recipe and how you can buy local ingredients from Ohio farmers, visit countrysidefoodandfarms.org. Thank you.